Ethan Hawke, and this is Dave's Film Faves. Still no theme song, still using a still image. Okay, in this one I'm taking a look at one of my all-time favorite films, and it's a movie that, despite having a good pedigree in front of and behind the camera, it's not all that well respected. And that's the 1998 modern-day telling of Great Expectations with Ethan Hawke and Gwyneth Paltrow. Cover. Now, around the time that this film was made, it was a little bit of a trend for classic literature to be updated for a modern time frame and aimed at a younger demographic. Some examples of this are usually horrible. Like, you had Romeo plus Juliet, the Baz Luhrmann piece of shit, where they're saying actual Shakespearean dialogue and saying, "Draw your sword," and then they pull out a pistol that has sword engraved on the side. Or 10 Things I Hate About You, that shitty movie that's based on Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew. And yes, I know that that movie is beloved by girls who were teenagers back when I was a teenager, and I don't care that he's dead, Heath Ledger was not a good actor. And don't bring up The Dark Knight, I'm not that big of a fan of his Joker either, but I digress because I'm going to get angry comments on that. And of course there was also O, the high school retelling of Othello with Josh Hartnett. Yeah, so you had a lot of these things going on. So, I actually know maybe more about the making of this movie than I ever expected to, thanks to a book called What Just Happened by Art Linson, who is the producer of this movie. Art Linson, funnily enough, is also a producer on one of my all-time favorite films, Fight Club, which is also from the same studio, 20th Century Fox. It's sort of weird that both of those movies, which are in my top 5, have the same producer. But basically, Art Linson was like, hey, we're having this trend. Great Expectations seems like it could make for a good romance. Great Expectations isn't that romantic. And there's been plenty of film adaptations of Dickens' novel just as a straight adaptation. There was one a couple of years ago that nobody saw, including myself. But probably the most famous one was in the 1940s by David Lean. There's a Criterion Blu-ray release of it, and it is a really good film and a really good adaptation, and probably a really good film from the 1940s. But this one has a personal resonance to me. It's no secret to people who know me very well that I'm a big fan of Ethan Hawke. It's part of the Hawke of Lennon Hawke, the last name I will eventually legally change my last name to, but is my last name for all internet purposes. When I was growing up, and by growing up I mean I'm probably like 13, 14 around this time, I just kept seeing Ethan Hawke play roles that I either identified with or that I wished I could identify with because I wasn't as cool, in movies like Reality Bites, in this, in Gattaca, and some other stuff that he did at the time. So Ethan Hawke sort of became like a weird role model during this time, plus the fact that he directed Lisa Loeb's Stay music video, and Lisa Loeb was like a big celebrity crush of mine for most of my childhood and teen years, and even now, if we're being honest. And he basically got her song onto the Reality Bites soundtrack and helped launch her career. So, long story short, big Ethan Hawke fan, and it kind of started around the era when I first saw this movie on HBO. And being a nerdy kid who is short and skinny and now bald, not very popular with the ladies, so a movie about unrequited love would, of course, sort of spark me, and unfortunately I think that sort of subgenre of unrequited love sort of maybe spawned the MRAs and some other assholes, because now watching movies like this, they view all women as like evil and things because they don't like them. That's not the case, but possibly that was a bad side effect of movies like this and the teen sex comedies of like the American Pie era, which came 1 year after this, actually. American Pie was 99. But I digress. Let's just talk about the movie. So it's updated to modern time. It now takes place in Florida, at least at the beginning, and we're introduced to young Finnegan Bell. Finnegan is the kid who would have been Pip in the original novel, but Pip, as we know from South Park, not the coolest name, even though it's short for Philip. So they changed it to Finnegan Bell. Why did they change it to Finnegan? Well, according to What Just Happened, that was the name of Ethan Hawke's dog at the time. Anyway, so Finnegan, his parents are dead. He's being raised by his older sister, and his older sister is dating a much older man. Well, maybe not much older, but at least like a decade and a half, if not 2 decades, named Joe, and Joe is a nice little guy, fisherman. And one day, Finn is playing around, and a escaped convict played by Robert De Niro, who basically did 3 days of filming on this movie as a gift to his friend Art Linson. And Finnegan helps him break out of his shackles and everything, and does him a good deed, even though Finnegan is sort of under the threat of murder from this convict. And then the convict goes on his way, and that's sort of a little moment there. And then later we find out, for odd purposes, that an older woman named Mrs. Dinsmore, who is the version of Miss Havisham from the original novel in this, and she's played by the great, now late Anne Bancroft, is going to pay Finnegan's sister for him to come over and hang out with her niece, Estella, who is a young blonde girl who is unusually cold, I would suppose. So he ends up going over there. There's some weird dancing. There's a lot of the song Besame Mucho that plays. And Estella seems to be extremely cold, and Finnegan is mainly there, because he's an artist, he's mainly there to like draw her and some stuff like that. And then one day Finn is drinking at the fountain, and Estella ends up giving him a kiss, sort of out of nowhere for no reason. And Finn, being a young boy, and Estella being a pretty girl, he like falls head over heels in love with her, as children are wont to do. So at that point, he keeps coming over. He keeps falling more and more in love with Estella, as they're there for, as a partner to help Estella with dancing lessons, is also part of the reason that he's being brought over. And then one night, they must be late teens at this point, even though it's the actors who aren't aged down all that well. They end up going to they're going to go to a party together as partners, as a couple. And Finn obviously has a huge crush on Estella, and Estella very much knows this. And Estella basically tries to kind of sort of seduce him, which leads to some sort of light fingering and some kissing, and then she just sort of abruptly stops and leaves. And he's like, "Hey, why are you leaving?" And she says something in French that he doesn't understand, and she leaves. And then he tries to go see her again, and she's gone away. And that's it, and it's like, oh, well, the love of his life is gone. And then, so Finnegan ends up just sort of moving on, and 7 years pass, and he's just sort of working with Joe as a fisherman, because by this point the sister has absconded, disappeared out of nowhere, so Joe has been raising him for most of his childhood and into his young adulthood. But Finn is kept sort of drawing, and some of his drawings ended up like hanging at a local bank and things like that. But then a lawyer ends up coming and is like, "Hey, there's a benefactor, and we don't know, I'm not at liberty to say who it is, but I'm going to pay you money, a lot of money, to paint some pictures, to paint some of your drawings or whatever, and you're going to come to New York and we're going to have an art showing for you." Now, Mrs. Dinsmore, who lives in this beautiful, decrepit, overgrown with ivy house, is very rich, and Finn makes the jumping assumption that it's Mrs. Dinsmore who's paying him money to put him on equal playing field with Estella, because Estella is a lot more rich and bourgeois than he is. He's just a poor fisher boy. And that this would help make him more worthy of Estella in Estella's eyes. So he's like, "Sure, I'll go to New York." Especially when he goes to confront Mrs. Dinsmore. He's like, "Hey, was this you?" And Mrs. Dinsmore doesn't say anything, but she does say, "Estella's in New York," so he makes the conclusion. So he goes to New York. By this point, he hasn't been drawing in a while, because his heart's been crushed and his life has been reduced to not much of anything. And then, he ends up, like, Estella he's drinking at the fountain in Central Park while he's sketching stuff, and Estella just comes in and kisses him, much like she originally kissed him first when he was sipping from a fountain. And Finn can't believe this is a coincidence, and then he gets sort of involved with her social circle. He goes to meet Estella and her fiancé, because she's engaged, played by Hank Azaria from Simpsons fame. Hank Azaria actually has one of my favorite lines in the movie. he proposes that Finn draw Estella for a picture because they think it would be a nice wedding gift, and he asks Finn, "Do you charge by the inch or by the hour?" Which I always thought was a very funny way to equate doing art and escorting or something like that. I always really love that line. And then, so Finn ends up like drawing her portrait, but it ends up to be a series of nude portraits. Out of nowhere, Estella just sort of undresses in his loft, and there's a nice, there's a really good montage of this where there's not quite a lot of nudity. It's just sort of brief cuts, or the angle of the camera is just above or just below where it would be to see Gwyneth Paltrow's nude body. And because of that, it's actually a lot more sexier than if you actually saw Gwyneth Paltrow's nude body, and the song Like a Friend is playing. By the way, this movie has an excellent soundtrack. There's like Chris Cornell's Sun Shower, there's that song Ingenue, which plays during the closing credits and played during the trailer. I actually own the soundtrack on CD still. It's got a really good, it didn't fall into the trap of the sort of late 90s alt-rock soundtrack, like something like, I don't know, like Daredevil had in the early 2000s, or even something like Reality Bites or Singles would have had in the early 90s with the grunge stuff. It found a nice little place there. But then, much like anything, Estella abruptly leaves. He chases her out, and they end up sort of in a cab, and Finn is sort of wondering, why do you keep doing this? And Estella has some really great lines about how, what if you taught a girl to always be afraid of the sun, that the sun would hurt you, and then one day you ask the girl to go outside and play, can you blame her? And it's from here that it starts to tie in with what we know, if you're familiar with the original Dickens novel, that Mrs. Dinsmore, or Havisham in the book, has been raising Estella for a specific, really dark purpose, but has been telling her, because Mrs. Dinsmore's heart had been broken when she was a younger girl. There's no cake in this movie, by the way. There's no like cake that she doesn't throw out. But because her heart had been broken once on, at the cusp of getting married, she decides to sort of have her niece be raised to hate men, but to also be an object of desire for men, so that she could continually break men's hearts as sort of a revenge against the male gender for the hurt that she felt. So, yeah, I mean, gender studies-wise, and especially in our modern era, this sort of thing probably didn't help with as far as men not thinking of women as like horrible like people that you see in the MRA movement. But you have to understand that Estella is sort of a tragic figure. She is a figure who has been raised pretty much in a mentally abusive way to turn her into this, because the movie makes it quite clear that if she were raised in a normal manner, even if it's just because this is the one boy that she was in close proximity with for most of her childhood, she would be reciprocal to his advances. But instead, she has been hardwired and programmed, almost like a kid who's been captured to fight in like a guerrilla war in Africa, to hurt this man who she knows loves her and is mostly a good guy. I mean, some stuff happens later. We see Finn sort of make up a backstory and lie in order to get another woman in bed, so we know that he too has also been sort of hurt by this and is not a 100% good guy, but he's not a terrible man. But of course neither is Hank Azaria, who is the fiancé there. I mean, aside from Mrs. Dinsmore, and even she is, I mean, even Mrs. Dinsmore you can still feel something for, because she was also hurt. And so you basically have a cycle of hurt people who keep hurting other people because they're incapable or lack the tools to help themselves. Which almost ties this into another movie I recently did for Dave's Film Faves Exotica, which is about hurt people who lack the tools to heal themselves. You can see why, as a teenager, when I A, could not get women to like me, and B, was horrendously depressed, would like this movie. And as the plot machinations go on, and I'm going to be a little bit more generous with spoilers in this video because this is a reasonably faithful adaptation of an old Dickens novel, and a lot of people already know what the basic storyline is of Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. Though this movie version does mostly focus on the love story, it does cut out a lot of the other stuff, especially about class. There is some stuff about there, but there's not as much of a class analysis in this as there was in Dickens' novel. But it turns out Mrs. Dinsmore, was not the benefactor behind Finn. It was the escaped convict. Uh, and that sort of knowledge also sort of crushes him because it means like, hey, this wasn't, it really was kind of a coincidence that Estella stumbled upon me, and I was meant to be an early target of hers. I wasn't meant to be another target, but because of proximity, I'm a target again. And the movie sort of ends with a kind of happy-ish ending, but, you know, it's much like how the original novel had a sad ending and a happy ending. It could go kind of either way. So, there's a few things I really love about this movie. Aside from the personal connection I have to the material based on where I was when I first saw this movie, and how my life has both been the same and different since then, where it has that personal connection. But this is a really underrated film. The director is Alfonso Cuaron. Prior to this movie, the only other thing he'd done was The Little Princess. Since this movie, this guy has done Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, he's done Gravity, he's done Children of Men. This guy has, Y tu mamá también. This guy has become a hugely respected director since the release of this movie. And this film is probably his least well-reviewed movie. In fact, nobody involved with this movie actually seems to like it. James Lipton brought it up to Gwyneth Paltrow in an episode of Inside the Actors Studio as like the special surprise movie that he was going to question her about that normally wouldn't be brought up. And Gwyneth Paltrow clearly, from her glazed face, doesn't care for this movie. I've never heard Ethan Hawke bring it up in an interview, and I read a lot of his interviews because I'm a big fan of his. Alfonso Cuaron in interviews usually says that it's a disappointment that he was compromised by the studio or whatever. So it's really not well liked by the people who made it. The movie doesn't have much of a fan base as far as I know, but it's beautifully shot. There's such lush greens and these great like close-ups and the use of light and the use of blurring around the edges with sharp focus in the front. The soundtrack and the use of music. I mean, the actors, you got Robert De Niro, Anne Bancroft. This is Gwyneth Paltrow before she went crazy with her goop stuff, the great Ethan Hawke. You have character little asides with what's his name, Chris Cooper, who ended up getting an Oscar for adaptation a few years after this, as Joe. You just had a really great cast, and they're really bringing these characters to life. But probably the thing that I love most about this movie is something that wasn't planned for. After the movie was finished filming, they thought that it lacked a certain something. So Art Linson, the producer, again, What Just Happened. By the way, this was also turned into a movie. I haven't seen it. Robert De Niro played Linson in it. But Art Linson got his friend David Mamet, you know, the great screenwriter and playwright. Well, he used to be great. Now he's kind of become like a right-wing asshole. But prior to becoming a huge right-wing asshole, he was a great playwright. And he wrote a great many good movies. He wrote Glengarry Glen Ross. He wrote The Edge with Anthony Hopkins, which is a favorite of mine that will probably end up on the series. Really great screenwriter, and he punched up some of the movie with voiceover. And the opening voiceover by Ethan Hawke's character, he says something that I think sets the stage for making the movie good. And without this voiceover, I don't know if my reaction to the film would be as positive. But he basically says, I'm not going to tell this story the way it happened. I'm going to tell it the way I remember it. And I feel that because the movie has a certain heightened sense of reality, like things happen that wouldn't happen in real life. There's a scene where Finn runs into a restaurant, and Estella's sitting there with her fiancé and another couple, and he just sort of reaches down to her, and she grasps his hand, and they just run out of the restaurant without saying anything. That probably wouldn't happen like that in real life. But if you're remembering a big sort of romantic, gutsy moment in your life, you're going to drown everything out, any objections, and it's just going to focus on that. So a lot of the unrealistic portions of the movie feel that way because they feel the way that these events would feel like in your memory looking back at moments like this. Where, you know, the pain is up to 11, you lower down the level of your own fault involved and make it seem like it wasn't as much. The hurt is heightened, the love is heightened, the sexiness seems to be lit like a beautiful movie, and it feels like sort of the way that memory can taint and distort our perception of the events that we've actually led. And not in a Inception or mindfucker bendy way, but just in a way that our memories tend to work. And if it weren't for that line, that wouldn't be a valid interpretation of the film, but with that line, everything just makes sense. And some of the voiceover dialogue is really great. It's really stuff like that Mamet would throw in. There's stuff like there's the transition for the 7 years between young Finn and adult Finn. And it was like, I put away childish things, I'd seen it all, I elected to grow up. And that then there's like he's fishing, and when he says I elected to grow up, he just throws a harpoon into a fish, and just the timing of that is magnificent. And there's a thing where he's talking about when he's drawing again, he's like, much as I had abandoned it, much as I had forgotten it, it was there. Just some of that voiceover really makes the movie. Like, the quality of the movie, I can't think of another movie where the voiceover enhances the quality of it so much more than if it weren't there. I mean, there are some movies where you just can't divorce the voiceover from it because it seems like it's woven into it. Fight Club comes to mind, American Psycho as well. But as far as a movie the movie would still work, you'd still be able to understand what was going on without the voiceover, unlike some of those other movies. But the voiceover actually exponentially increases the quality of the movie, and it's one of those things. So, I mean, plus you have... I'm completely forgetting that Little Nell from Rocky Horror also has a supporting role as the art gallery runner or whatever, curator or something. But there's so much great things about this movie. The visuals are beautiful. We expect that from Alfonso Cuaron. The soundtrack works so well. The acting is great. And I do love that it basically is just what a hurt young man's memory would be like of, his broken heart. And obviously, we don't normally meet people who are raised with the specific purpose of hurting somebody outside of a Neil LaBute film. That usually doesn't happen. So this isn't a realistic love story or anything like that, and people don't tend to purposefully hurt them in this type of premeditated way. But within the universe that this film creates, everything just works. Like, there's... My only complaint that keeps this movie from being perfect, and again, to me, I don't expect everybody to love it, because it's a mix of the visuals, the sound, the acting, the story, and the personal connection to myself. And the personal connection to myself and how I felt at the time watching the movie, that's not something anybody else is going to have. You might have your own personal connection to it, but that's just sort of a je ne sais quoi that no one else is going to have with the movie. But aside from the stuff with Robert De Niro in the third act where you find out that he's the benefactor, that feels tacked on, because it's like we have all the romantic storyline. Estella ends up flying away with her fiancé, and Finn's left alone. And by the way, there's a great scene where he's stuck in the rain, and he's yelling up because he thinks Estella's in the building, and he's just saying, I sold them all my paintings, everything I've ever done has been for you, everything that's good in me is you. And he's buzzed up, and it's just Mrs. Dinsmore, and he's like, yeah, I did this. Sorry, you're a nice kid. But I trained her to hurt, so we're all going to be hurt, basically, in much better dialogue than that. But after that, there's the thing with Robert De Niro, and he's the benefactor, and he gets stabbed on a train, and then that's about it. That part feels tacked on. It's not integrated into the film as well as it could have been. But that's my only complaint. Otherwise, I find this movie to be rather flawless as far as, if there's no such thing as a perfect movie, but as far as a movie that is, the movie has a certain goal, and it's meant to be entertaining, it's meant to make you feel emotion, it's meant to be visually pleasing, aesthetically pleasing, orally pleasing, and it has these certain goals, and I think this movie meets every one of its goals. Aside from that tacked on sort of story structure thing at the end, I don't have any problem with anything else in this movie. This movie is as close to flawless as any movie I've ever seen, which is odd that the people who made it don't like it. And the movie was not a financial success. It bombed. It was like a January release in '98. It was completely forgotten. It's really only because Alfonso Cuaron has become this famous auteur that now people sometimes look at it when they're looking at his whole filmography. But no one really cares about this movie in and of itself. And it's a shame, because honestly, if I'm just speaking about Cuaron's work, I think Children of Men is a visually stunning movie that I don't have an emotional connection to, and I feel that the third act is just a bunch of stuff blowing up in rubble. I don't like that movie as much as intellectually I appreciate it. Gravity is a good movie, even though the metaphor of space for losing a child is really fucking blatant. I didn't care for Y Tu Mamá Tambien, even though everybody seems to love that. I haven't seen Little Princess. And Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, a lot of people think that's the best movie of the Harry Potter movie series. I didn't like it. I actually preferred Christopher Columbus's first two movies, not because they're great or anything, but just because they capture the experience of reading the books more, and also they were lush and colorful, and I understand that it has to get darker as the stories get darker, but the other movies are just really muddy and ugly next to those first two movies where you have the magic and the wonder. So, I don't know, I don't like, and Cuaron basically set the direction of the other Harry Potter films. After David Yates took over and all that, they all pretty much followed in his footsteps. And at that point, I think the movie series kind of didn't go as well as it could have. So, I'm not a huge fan of Cuaron. This is really the only movie of his that I out and out love. And it's just weird that this is the movie of his that everyone else looks down upon or thinks is forgettable. But that's why I'm here, to do videos about the movies that I love that I feel don't get the respect or the recognition they deserve. Anyway, this is the DVD copy I have. I'm pretty sure it's been released on Blu-ray. By the way, there's no bonus features on this. It's just a trailer. That's it. A lot of these movies that I love, they're pretty unsung, so they don't get anything. I don't know if any extras have ever been released on any home video release of this. I actually have a framed poster of this movie. It has a couple more supporting characters at the bottom, but I haven't had time to hang posters in my apartment yet, so it's not up for you to see. It might be up in some of my way older YouTube videos though. But so that's how much I really love this movie. I think it's almost flawless. And yeah, any sort of quibbles since then are just part of what role this movie and a lot of other movies, probably starting from the 80s and up, have me played in having nerdy guys grow up to hate women because they think all women only like assholes and are sort of manipulative and stuff like that. I could probably make another video about that topic and how sort of movies have created that plus the damsel in distress thing and all that stuff, but I'm not here for that. I'm just talking about how much I love the movie. That's a different film essay for another time. But that's about all I have to say for right now about the Great Expectations 1998 version. I've rambled on almost half an hour now. Don't know what the next movie's going to be. We'll find out at some point, or at least I'll choose. I don't know, maybe I'll put up a poll at some point and let you choose out of a couple nominees. But I did promise it wasn't going to be a Canadian film, and this is not a Canadian film. Mexican director, American film. So maybe I'll leave the continental US for the next time, I don't know. So, that's all I have to say for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll